the scene that greeted 6 American adventurers in early March 1989 when they landed in a town named Anadyr in the Soviet Far East. The bitter cold, howling winds couldn't chill the warmth of the welcome from their Soviet hosts. It was the beginning of a unique expedition, a joint Soviet-American exercise in adventure and citizen diplomacy that would have international repercussions that no one could have predicted.
This is an Eyewitness News special in cooperation with the National Geographic Society. The Bering Bridge, the Soviet-American expedition from Siberia to Alaska.
Good evening, I'm Jason Davis, and for the next 30 minutes, we'll take you where no Western cameras have been before. We'll give you an idea of what it's like to break the ice of Siberia, the Bering Sea, and Alaska, and the Cold War that separated the region for so long. What you are about to see is a documentary shot partly by the team members themselves, but largely by KSTP photographers as we traveled in this most remote part of the world. The Arctic region of the Soviet Far East, a place with many moods, all of them with their own beauty, just like the extraordinary people who live there.
Desolate hills and vast expanses of snow. Springtime in the Soviet far northeast. This is the district of Chukotka, an isolated corner of the Soviet Union, a place off limits even to most Soviets, and more isolated than Siberia itself. It's not the sort of landscape most people would associate with superpower diplomacy, yet that's precisely what a team of Soviet and American adventurers is here to accomplish. On the wings of Glasnost, they're trying to bridge the gap between 2 continents. In time, they will succeed, but it won't be easy. The idea for the expedition came from Paul Shirky, a Minnesota explorer. In addition to the obvious physical challenges, it will test his skill in unifying a potentially fragmented team.
There's immense diversity represented among this team of 12 people. We had, in that group, there are 5 different languages. There are 5 different cultural backgrounds, and there are, of course, at least 2 very strong political ideologies. And so I wondered, you throw that together, and what kind of chemistry are you going to have, especially in very difficult, trying physical situations.
What Shirky proposed was a 1,200-mile trek from the Soviet Union across the Bering Strait to Alaska. At its narrowest point, only 53 miles separate the coastlines of the 2 countries. But during the years of the Cold War, all contact was completely cut off. If a team of Americans and Soviets can cross the frozen sea together, they will re-establish ancient ties and help advance the current thaw in East-West relations. Since this would be a joint expedition, Shirky wanted to share the leadership with a Soviet. Dmitry Shaparo, the USSR's premier Arctic explorer, volunteered.
Все-таки понимаете, конечно, для меня очень важно установление хороших отношений между Соединенными Штатами Америки и Советским Союзом.
Good relations between America and the Soviet Union are very important to me. And good relations between Chukotka and Alaska, all that's wonderful. But for me, what's most important is what's going on in my own country. And having Americans come to Chukotka strongly accelerates the process of opening doors.
The rest of the team is equally divided between Soviets and Americans. Among them are 3 Alaskan Eskimos and 3 natives of Chukotka. The expedition is underway by early March. At the end of one of the stormiest winters in memory. Shirky's rigorous schedule calls for them to reach the Bering Strait before the ice becomes too soft to ski across, less than a month away. After crossing the strait, they'll continue the trek through Alaska, a journey by ski and dog sled into an uncharted realm of Soviet-American relations. But if the winds of Glasnost are blowing warmer, the winds of Chukotka are not.
This was a surprisingly challenging trip in terms of the physical demands made on us. Wind was the biggest physical factor that we were up against, and we slogged through a couple dozen windstorms in the last 2 months, immense windstorms, storms with gale force winds 60 to 80 miles an hour that would continue unabated day and night for 3 or 4 days. Team members were knocked down time and again, but we just accepted it as a way of life.
I just didn't know wind existed like that, where you're standing up and you're walking along and you're literally knocked over by wind one day, or you've got a heavy pack on and you're slogging along trying to figure out who these team members are and how this expedition's going to come together, and all of a sudden it starts raining. It's the beginning of the expedition and you think, my word, what is this going to be like? We ended up tent-bound for several days, and for me personally, it gave a little bit of time for downtime, rest time. There was some singing, some beautiful music, and it sort of helped, I think, gel a certain tone of conviviality.
But as pleasant as these periods of forced inactivity may be, they threaten the team's plan to cross the Bering Strait before the ice breaks up. Shirky wants to force the pace, a suggestion that meets resistance from his Soviet counterpart.
Я считаю, что мы не должны
I don't think we should hurry so much, and I tell Paul this. It's not a question of a difference in character or in age, but in our philosophy of traveling. Paul wants to make this a productive trip, and so do I. But I think I see better than he does the reality of the situation. And the reality is that the people on this trip aren't sufficiently prepared to go faster, and that goes for everyone.
I don't know if it's just a profound difference between American and Soviet culture, but I found that Soviet team members had a very different sense and value for time than the American team members. And basically, we were always, the American team members were concerned to keep making the miles and try to stay on schedule, and the Soviets were, hey, relax, have some tea.
Коля,
My man Kolya harnesses the dogs only when he decides to. It's useless to hurry him. His whole life he was taught not to hurry. He can't learn in 1 month to start. If I don't watch out for this team, someone could suffer. We could end up without Kolya and without any dog.
Я считаю, что гораздо больше успех, если мы все 12...
If we get to Alaska 2 days ahead of schedule with 11 people instead of 12, in my mind it's not a success, but a failure.
There were quarrels about our use of time, and a few long nights in the tent. We had it out, talking about the next day's plan and just how far we were going to go and what time we were going to get up in the morning and how many hours we were going to travel. And took a lot of discussion, a lot of compromise, and just mostly took a lot of patience. I think all of us, both the Soviets and Americans, would agree that we learned more about patience on this trip than anything else.
In spite of their profound cultural and personal differences, the team presses on, stopping at Chukotka towns and villages along the way. In all kinds of weather, crowds come out to greet the foreigners. Not since the days before the Cold War started have these people had such a visit from across the Bering Sea.
Ну, например, мы были в тех поселках, где никогда не были американцы.
We were in villages where people think Americans are almost physically different from us. I don't know. 3 arms and 3 legs, such were the conversations that came up. They were surprised that these were simple, ordinary people, Americans. who wanted the same things they did. Their eyes were opened because we had brought them new impressions about America.
For the Eskimos on the team, the trip was special in another way. Through centuries of contact, the Eskimos of Chukotka and Alaska had maintained a common heritage of language, music, and dance. The Cold War made sharing that heritage impossible. Now, after 4 decades of separation, they can celebrate together.
For our Eskimo team members, this expedition was a profoundly emotional experience because they were connecting with a cultural heritage in a very deep, meaningful way, in a way that, I will never fully comprehend because I'm not native. I do not know the instinctual connections they feel with that land across the sea over there.
By the end of the 3rd week, the expedition has covered over 400 miles. The pressure to make up lost time adds to the team's growing fatigue. The villages are starting to blend together, and it's getting harder now to summon up the energy for citizen diplomacy.
We, in fact, would hold meetings before we'd enter the villages to kind of psych ourselves up for the fact that even though we put in a 50-mile day, we're very tired. We'd like nothing more than to get a good meal and go to sleep, that it can't be that way. Because the way we act, we respond to these folks in the next few hours when they first receive us is going to have a tremendous effect on what they think about America, what they think about the rest of the world.
Меня зовут Paul Shirley. Bueno. Я американский руководитель экспедиции Беринга мост.
But the harmony that characterizes the village stopovers seems to recede during the grueling days on the trail. Tempers grow short. Even the dog teams are affected.
The Soviet dog team, it turned out, was quite aggressive and took a nip out of our dogs every chance they could. A couple of the dogs on their team that we used in the expedition were regularly getting into trouble in the villages, getting in fights with the village dogs or, far worse, biting kids. So I explained to Dimitri that I felt that we were responsible for looking after these dogs as expedition leaders. He said, no, we're not responsible. It's the children that are responsible. They shouldn't be near the dogs. Well, obviously, a very different perception of the problem.
And the problem is only compounded by the language barrier.
We do not need... All Soviet dogs will be Soviet Union. No dogs Soviet to Alaska.
That's not the point.
Well, the cultural clashes and the value differences make clear to me that citizen diplomacy is hard work. Even though there were times where it was terribly frustrating and I was about to pull my hair out and had no idea what to do next in terms of attempting to find some common ground here, you still get that adrenaline rush realizing that this is such a unique leadership challenge that I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world.
You understand? No.
5 weeks after the trek began, the team reaches the Bering Strait. But just as Shirky feared, the ice has started to break up. Crossing on foot will not be possible. Over 30 miles of open water lie between the team and their destination. 2 small islands in the middle of the strait, one Soviet, the other American. The only solution, the traditional walrus skin boat called a umiak. But no one has crossed these waters by umiak in years, and the Bering Sea is treacherous, unpredictable.
It was the most adventurous part of the whole expedition for me, which is ironic. It was relatively short and we spent the most time on skis, but in terms of something where one has a sense of a major risk involved, that was for the crossing. It took a lot of preparation. I had to come to terms with the fact that if this boat fell over for any set of reasons, that my chances of living were minimal. And I accepted that.
We were all very nervous out there in that boat being tossed around in the waves, but it was immensely beautiful to be in that slender little craft of a design that is thousands of years old. And we were surrounded by whales and walrus. We saw polar bears on the ice floes. And then finally, after many hours at sea, through the fog, we could see the cliffs of Big Diamond Island and realized that we were about to reach our destination and made history in the process.
On a stretch of ice between the two islands, a Soviet delegation arrives to meet the expedition. Among them are politicians, party members, journalists, and natives. An indication that the expedition is regarded as important in Moscow. Meanwhile, the Soviet Border Patrol prepares for one of the journey's most emotional moments, a ceremony at a point symbolic of the Soviet-American border. Members of the expedition ski across and, for a moment at least, east and west are finally joined. The Bering Bridge is open. Yet just as the celebrations are over, an event that will taint this moment is taking shape. One more irony in the history of superpower relations. Two journalism students from Moscow, members of the official Soviet delegation, have decided to ask the United States for political asylum. To expedition members, the news comes as a shock.
The defections came as a big a surprise for our team as it did for everyone else that followed the news story. It was an embarrassment to the Soviets because here we are caught up in a whole series of projects to celebrate Soviet-American cooperation, and yet once again they have to deal with the fact that there are many people in their country who are not happy being there.
This is, of course, not good for the expedition that these journalists suddenly stayed behind. But in the American press and television, this is the first time I've come across these war defectors. And it seems to me that these are people who really have some sort of defect.
The Soviet team members' reaction to the defection was that these two young men are very selfish, that here we are working on international relations in a corner of the world that's vitally important, that's long been ignored, and in one fell swoop, two young guys from Moscow who have no connection to the expedition end up having the possibility of turning all that work around, turning it backwards, not just around.
For 2 days, the defection casts a pall on the team, threatening to spoil the goodwill that they've worked so hard to generate. Still, as they begin the final leg of their journey, it's clear that the setback is only a momentary one. No minor diplomatic incident can take away their overriding feeling of accomplishment.
For me, this trip, it's a reaffirmation that you hit upon a good idea, and if it's the right idea, it works, because this one worked, and a lot was accomplished through it. Not just a grand adventure, but had a very positive, lasting impact on a great many people.
Our expedition is a significant step in improving relations between the Soviet Union and the United States, because we have taught ourselves that most of the doors that have been closed could have been opened a long time ago.
It's been more than 6 months since the Bering Bridge was completed. But it didn't end in Alaska. In fact, it'll be difficult to tell if the process that Paul Shirky and Dmitry Shapiro began in March 1989 will ever end.
The experience has changed my life forever. The spin-offs from it have been overwhelming. Almost weekly, another new idea comes out of Bering Bridge that either we generate or I'm asked to be involved with. Many exchanges, and it's been fun.
As our documentary reveals and Paul Shirky's new book confirms, there are deep traditional, ideological and cultural differences between the Soviet people and Americans. Bridging that gap is not easy. It takes hard work and determination. It takes the ability to overcome setbacks, like the defection of 2 young Soviets right at the climax of an expedition dedicated to making that kind of act unnecessary. But in the afterglow of the Bering Bridge expedition, even such a treacherous act can be, if not ignored, at least overlooked.
Dmitry confirmed from Moscow that the incident had no negative impact on the Soviet government's attitude towards their expedition. One of them, Anatoly, I understand, was about to pick up a job with CNN in Atlanta as a commentator on Soviet American affairs, and the other, Alexander, still living with a family in Anchorage working on his English skills. So it's a story with, I guess, a good ending.
The chapter is seemingly closed for the 2 defectors, but the story goes on. Paul Shirky's Bering Bridge expedition hastened the signing of a Soviet-American treaty, allowing natives on both sides of the Bering Sea to visit each other freely. Citizen diplomats in the little town of Walker, Minnesota, host half a dozen Soviets for a grassroots visit. And 2 young men get ready to drive their snowmobiles from Minnesota to Moscow. The bridge is built. All people have to do is cross it.
It'll take many Americans a long time before they accept the fact that maybe what's going on is for real this time. But if we believe in it, it is for real, because it all comes down to the people and the desire on the part of all Americans and Soviets to make this happen. And that's what our team is all about. And if that can be extended to other people as well, then we've done our job.
I'm Jason Davis. Good night.